In the dusty heart of Burkina Faso, where the sun sears the barren earth and the wind whispers secrets of a turbulent past, a revolutionary's voice rose, echoed and reverberated across the African plains. This revolutionary was none other than Thomas Sankara, the late former president of Burkina Faso. Sankara rose to power in 1983 and he immediately became a committed, self-sacrificing rebel who, during his 4 years as a leader of a small impoverished nation, sought to improve the lives of ordinary people while at the same time projecting the country onto the international stage. Unfortunately, on October 15, 1987, armed men burst into the office of Captain Thomas Sankara and murdered him alongside 12 of his aides in a violent coup d'etat. In events that eerily paralleled those in the Congo 27 years earlier when Patrice Lumumba was murdered, the attackers cut up Sankara's body and buried his remains in a hastily prepared grave. In this episode of African Biographics, we cover the story of an icon, Captain Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso. Born on December 21, 1949, in the village of Yako in Upper Volta, now known as Burkina Faso, Thomas Isidore Noah Sankara was the third of 10 children. His father, Joseph Sankara, served in the French army during the Second World War, and his mother, Margarita Kinder, instilled in her children a strong moral compass and respect for education. His early years were spent in Gaoua, a town in the humid southwest, and as the son of one of the few African functionaries then employed by the colonial state, Thomas enjoyed a relatively privileged upbringing. The family lived in a brick house at the top of a beautiful hill overlooking the rest of the town. But young Thomas played with other children and sat alongside local classmates once he started primary school. As a result, he soon became aware of their conditions and the wider world around him. In the colonial era, Upper Volta, or Haute Volta as it was named by the French authorities, was regarded as little more than a remote backwater with few resources deemed worthy of exploitation except as a labor reserve of young able-bodied men. This meant that Upper Volta experienced far less investment or infrastructure development than did many African colonies in the coastal regions. Compared with the practice in France's richer colonial territories, Paris sent relatively few French administrators to Upper Volta. There were enough in Gaoua, however, for the young Thomas to notice how differently they lived from the African population and how much more privileged the European children of his age were. Occasionally, Thomas Sankara got into scrapes with European children in school or around the town. When Thomas was 11 years old, just a few days before Upper Volta gained independence from France, he and some friends organized a mock ceremony to lower the French flag and raise the colors of the new nation. Now, because of this mock ceremony, a brawl ensued between European and African boys. Although Thomas himself was not involved, the school director demanded that his father punish him with a beating. His father refused. Young Thomas applied himself seriously to his schoolwork, excelling in mathematics and French. He went to church often, participated in a church scout troop, and devoted his time to religious studies. Some of the priests were impressed with his energy and eagerness to learn, and they encouraged Thomas to go to a seminary school once he had finished his primary courses. Thomas initially agreed, but he also took the exam required for entry into the 6th grade in the secular educational system. He passed this exam. When his father, Joseph Sankara, told the priest that Thomas would not be joining a seminary after all, they responded that he had not prayed hard enough for his son. Thomas Sankara continued his education at a state secondary school. Here, he continued to concentrate on his regular studies. He still did very well in mathematics and French, took part in theater productions, went to the movies, and started a regimen of physical exercise. As a student, Thomas Sankara became known for his exceptional intelligence and strong moral compass. He quickly became a respected figure among his peers and teachers alike. Meanwhile, the newly independent country was in turmoil. Upper Volta's first president, Maurice Yameogo, was never a particularly inspiring figure. He maintained a strong connection to France, with numerous French advisors working in both the army and the civil administration. Over time, President Yameogo became more autocratic and jailed many of his critics. The president even appointed relatives to key positions and engaged in extravagant personal spending while simultaneously imposing austerity on state employees and cracking down on trade unions. At the same time, President Yameogo appeared oblivious as his unpopularity grew. This situation finally came to a head on January 3, 1966, when workers launched a general strike. Large crowds of students, unemployed youths, workers, and others poured into the streets of Ouagadougou, the capital, in a popular insurrection. After army officers refused to follow the president's orders to disperse the demonstrators by force, it was clear for all to see that President Yameogo was finished. He agreed to resign and hand power over to the army commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sanguele Lamizana. While all of this was taking place, Sankara was focused on his final secondary school exams. He did hear over the radio, however, that Lamizana had established a new military academy in Ouagadougou, the first in the country, and that as part of its first cohort of prospective junior officers, it would take in 3 students who had just obtained their secondary school certificates. The military was popular at the time, having just ousted President Yameogo, the hated president. Young Thomas Sankara joined the academy's first intake in 1966 at the tender age of 17, stepping onto the same career path his father had once pursued. As with his earlier studies, Sankara took the challenges of the military academy seriously. Although the physical training was rigorous, especially for someone of modest build, he persisted and actually began to thrive. The military academy also taught its trainee officers a variety of academic subjects, including social sciences. For those topics, it employed civilian professors, and one of them was the academic director, Adama Toure, who taught history and geography at the academy. In his lectures, Adama Toure talked about imperialism and neocolonialism, socialism and communism, the Soviet and Chinese revolutions, the liberation movements in Africa, and other similar topics. Although Sankara had already started to become politically aware, this was the first time he was exposed to a revolutionary perspective on the Upper Volta and the world at large. 3 years later, Thomas Sankara completed his studies at the military academy. He was one of just 2 graduates selected for more advanced officer training in Madagascar. Thomas arrived there in October of 1969. At the academy in Madagascar, the range of instruction went beyond standard military subjects. Sankara was particularly drawn to courses on agriculture, including how to raise crop yields and better the lives of farmers, themes he would later take up in his own country. Beyond widening his knowledge and range of skills, he lost no opportunity to supplement his official instruction with further political education. Several of his professors at the academy in Madagascar were left-wing French academics, and Sankara sometimes had dinner with them. His last year in Madagascar coincided with an unprecedented period of political turmoil marked by peasant revolts, general strikes, huge public demonstrations against a conservative pro-French regime, and finally, a military takeover that steadily brought ever more radical officers into high positions of power. In the early 1970s, Thomas Sankara was sent to the prestigious Parachute Training Center in France. He worked his way up the ranks in the military while also making contacts with African radical students and organizations in France that helped shape his revolutionary mentality. In 1974, he returned to Upper Volta and began actively participating in meetings of various left-wing groups, among them some of the more prominent trade unions. Sankara would attend these meetings usually dressed in civilian clothes. All of these meetings were held secretly since the law prohibited any gatherings of groups opposing the government. Sankara's involvement with these groups proved critical to forging relationships that helped him assume power in the 1980s. Thomas Sankara served on the front lines in a border war between Upper Volta and Mali in 1974, although he saw this dispute over a worthless strip of land as a futile exercise. He thought the war was senseless, having erupted over some badly drawn lines on a colonial map and pitting 2 poor African countries with shared cultural and ethnic affinities. The experience of the war also appears to have further alienated Sankara from the military's higher command. At the time, he had become disillusioned with the senior officers, and this war simply confirmed in his eyes that the officers were more attentive to lining their own pockets than to the conditions of their troops or the need for an efficient, professional army capable of defending the country. Anyways, Thomas Sankara became commander of his country's Commando Training Center in 1976, and 2 years later established an important friendship with the man who was to become his best friend, Captain Blaise Compaoré, after meeting him in Morocco. Though focused on his responsibilities at the training center and on his new family life, Sankara remained painfully aware of the desperate conditions facing his country's people. The Upper Volta was one of the poorest nations in the world. Its 7 million inhabitants at the time had an annual average per capita income of just $211. Less than 1 in 10 lived in a city, and the adult literacy rate barely reached 11%. Only 18% of children of school-going age were in primary school, and a mere 3% made it to secondary school. Recurrent droughts, soil erosion, and stagnant crop yields meant that hunger was common. Poor nutrition and disease cut lives very short. The average life expectancy was an abysmal 44 years. Fueled by anger at such a reality, Sankara's conviction deepened that fundamental change had to come. During his visits to the capital, Ouagadougou, and on yet more military training missions to France and Morocco, he systematically pursued contacts with those who thought likewise. Some of those like-minded individuals were in the military, including Captain Blaise Compaoré. For Sankara and his colleagues, change in Upper Volta was very much needed. Yet Sankara's study of revolutions had taught him that it could be reckless to act prematurely. So he and his colleagues bided their time, at least for a little while longer. On November 25, 1980, Colonel Salh Zebo led a coup d'etat in Upper Volta under the pretext of eroding state authority. In late 1981, as Salh Zebo's fragile military regime sought to shore up its credibility, it brought in Thomas Sankara as Minister of Information. Unfortunately, that move backfired. Thomas Sankara supported the local media in exposing high-level corruption, and when the regime turned more repressive, he resigned and publicly denounced it. Detention and house arrest followed. Another military coup, this time partly reflecting the growing strength of younger left-leaning officers, took place on November 7, 1982. It was led by Captain Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo, who then appointed Thomas Sankara as Prime Minister of Upper Volta on January 10, 1983. As Prime Minister, Sankara began his foreign state trips to Tripoli, Libya, and attended the Non-Aligned Summit in New Delhi, India, where he met Fidel Castro, Samora Machel of Mozambique, and Maurice Bishop of Grenada. As Prime Minister, Thomas Sankara started preaching an anti-imperialistic message. His anti-imperialist stance and his rapidly growing grassroots popularity increasingly put him at odds with conservative elements in Upper Volta, including President Ouedraogo. Again, Thomas Sankara used state office to agitate for change, including by supporting labor mobilizations, denouncing corruption, criticizing the conservative sway of traditional chiefs, and espousing anti-imperialist foreign policy positions. Unsurprisingly, alarm bells sounded in France, which was now starting to become worried about the political evolution of one of its old colonies, Upper Volta. The conservative senior officers in President Ouedraogo's regime were encouraged to mount an internal coup in May of 1983 to depose and arrest Thomas Sankara and his closest colleagues. However, this did not go as planned. Large demonstrations hit Ouagadougou involving high school students, youths from poor neighborhoods, and some trade unionists. The protesters chanted "Free Sankara" and chanted slogans against France. Secret civilian committees were formed to oppose this coup d'etat, and anti-government factions were formed in the military. The most serious of these was a paratrooper garrison in Po that remained under the control of Captain Blaise Compaoré, then a Sankara loyalist. Finally, on August 4, 1983, Blaise Compaoré led some 250 paratroopers to Ouagadougou to seize major installations in coordination with Sankara, other military personnel, and units of civilian supporters. By that evening, Sankara was on the air to proclaim the overthrow of the government and the creation of a new National Council of the Revolution, the CNR. At just 34 years old, Captain Thomas Sankara had become the youngest leader of an African republic. Top of President Sankara's political agenda was waging war on poverty, which reached a critical level due to a horrible drought that ravaged the country in 1983 and 1984. To this end, he nationalized all land and mineral wealth and implemented state-led agricultural programs. His audacious agrarian reform took away land from feudal landlords and put it into the hands of peasants. This reform saw agricultural production skyrocket, safeguarding the nation's food security. Thomas Sankara's reforms were widespread, both at a symbolic level and in terms of political and economic reforms. For instance, in 1984, he changed the country's name from Upper Volta, the name it kept from colonialism, to Burkina Faso, which translates to the land of the upright people. Indeed, he strived to free his nation from the chains of colonial dependency and instill a sense of pride and cultural heritage. His regime outlawed tribute payments and obligatory labor to village chiefs, abolished rural poor taxes, built railways, and kick-started public housing construction. Thomas Sankara's administration also aggressively embarked on an anti-corruption drive in the civil service. The government also launched initiatives towards environmental sustainability. Understanding the relationship between deforestation and agricultural productivity, they kicked off a nationwide 10 million tree planting initiative to combat desertification that was creeping in from the Sahara. This would be one of the first major afforestation projects in Africa. Women, the poor, and the country's peasantry benefited mostly from these reforms. Thomas Sankara's government promoted gender equality in a very male-dominated society. In fact, Thomas Sankara was one of the first heads of state to condemn female genital mutilation, forced marriages, underage marriages, and polygamous practices. Sankara once told a local audience in 1984, "Socially, women are relegated to third place after the man and the child, just like the third world, arbitrarily held back." President Thomas Sankara appointed females into high government positions, encouraged them to work and become financially independent, and recruited them into the military. In September 1984, one day marked the day where men were encouraged to switch roles with women by, for instance, going to the market for food shopping and preparing meals at home. All of these roles were traditionally done by women in Burkina Faso. This practical exercise was enforced and encouraged by Sankara so that men could get first-hand experience and know what women go through in taking care of their families. In healthcare, Sankara launched a vaccination campaign on an unprecedented scale. This vaccination drive led to about 2.5 million children being immunized against diseases such as meningitis, yellow fever, and measles. This significantly lowered child mortality rates. President Sankara also established health centers throughout the country. This included establishing more than 284 clinics for childbirth as well as 87 pharmacies. Education also saw a significant uplift under Sankara's leadership. A nationwide literacy campaign saw school attendance rise dramatically, taking literacy rates from a dismal 13% in 1983 to an impressive 73% by the year 1987. President Thomas Sankara became popular for how he openly disdained the customary pomp and ceremony that generally come with high office. For example, official portraits of the president, so common in public buildings across Africa, were prohibited. Young activists were discouraged from chanting his name. Thomas Sankara was normally driven to meetings and public events not in limousines but in modest cars. Once a week, he played soccer with his advisors and staff, and passers-by could see him dressed in shorts and a football jersey. Sometimes Sankara appeared unannounced at public events, with participants only gradually becoming aware of his presence when they glanced to the side or rear and saw him quietly standing there, perhaps wearing a tracksuit. Such levels of informality from the president were designed to send a message, with the message being that leaders should be modest and that, especially in such a poor country, they should not live the high life. The president discouraged the luxuries that came with government offices and encouraged others to do the same. In this regard, Thomas Sankara earned a modest salary of around $450 a month and forbade the use of a chauffeur-driven Mercedes and first-class airline tickets by his ministers and senior civil servants. In a country where civil service salaries were far above the incomes of most other Burkinabe, with the public sector taking up a big share of the state budget, Sankara tightened up considerably on the incomes and perks that state employees had come to expect. Numerous bonuses were simply eliminated. These measures caused considerable disgruntlement throughout the civil service, even though the upper echelons generally had to give up a bigger share. Government ministers and other senior officials lost their expense accounts. 2/3 of the government's auto fleet was sold off and only small cars were kept, even for ministers. State officials who were assigned individual cars were strictly prohibited from keeping them outside working hours without permission. This was done to prevent them from using the vehicles for informal business activities. True to his frugal ways, Sankara ensured that the costs of official travel were kept to a minimum. Burkinabe officials traveling abroad were required to fly economy class and stay in the most modest accommodations, including official consular or embassy residences. A staff member of Burkina Faso's United Nations mission in New York recalled Sankara's 1984 visit there. On this particular occasion, mattresses were put on the mission floors for government ministers accompanying him. President Sankara reminded them that the money saved on hotel bills would be better used for new wells and schools back home in Burkina Faso. In 1987, his last year in power, Thomas Sankara publicly declared all the sources of income and assets of himself and his wife Mariam. From the items declared, it was clear that President Sankara had not used his position as leader to amass wealth. His 2 sons remained enrolled in public school, while his wife continued to report daily for her job at the government's shipping agency, where she was a transportation specialist. His parents lived in the same house they had occupied before. His father had now retired, but his mother was still selling spices and condiments to bring in some extra income. Around the world, Thomas Sankara soon became famous for his rebuke of what he saw as the neo-colonial relations between Europe and Africa, characterized by financial exploitation in the form of loans and aid from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. To him, this relationship was a new form of the same old dynamic between former colonial powers and formerly colonized countries. He even stated that imperialism is a system of exploitation that occurs not only in the brutal form of those who come with guns to conquer territory. Imperialism often occurs in more subtle forms: a loan, food aid, and blackmail. We are fighting this system that allows a handful of men on earth to rule all of humanity. Rejecting aid from the IMF and the World Bank, Sankara strived for local economic development, hoping to place Burkina Faso on a path to financial independence.
De quoi nous nourrir? Nous pouvons dépasser même notre production, malheureusement. Par manque d'organisation, nous sommes encore obligés de tendre la main pour demander des aides alimentaires. Ces aides alimentaires qui nous bloquent, qui nous inspire, qui installe dans nos esprits cette habitude, ces réflexes de mendiant.
It was at the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, that his speeches were the most fervent. Thomas Sankara called for unity and denounced neocolonialism and the unjust debt imposed on African nations.
Qui ici ne souhaite pas que la dette soit purement et simplement effacée? Celui qui ne le souhaite pas, il peut sortir, prendre son avion et aller tout de suite à la Banque mondiale payer. Tous nous souhaitons. Notre conférence adopte la nécessité de dire clairement que nous ne pouvons pas payer la dette. Non pas.
Sankara was sending a clear message to African countries that they had to be self-reliant and not depend on foreign aid, which often came with conditions that undermined their sovereignty. He argued that unlike Europe, which was assisted to rebuild post-war, Africa was instead being asked to pay those who brought war and plunder to it. Such hypocrisy and double standards were deemed unacceptable by Thomas Sankara, which is why he strongly urged Africa to act as a united bloc in refusing to pay. Despite the profound and sweeping changes that marked Thomas Sankara's tenure, his revolutionary approach also made him enemies both at home and abroad, ultimately leading to his assassination in a coup d'etat in 1987. But more on this later. President Thomas Sankara's regime was not immune to undemocratic practices. Beneath the shore of empowerment and progress, there were undercurrents of controversy that would leave somewhat of a blemish on his legacy. Even the most brilliant of leaders, such as Thomas Sankara, can't escape the touch of authoritarianism. For instance, his revolutionary defense committees, initially designed to be community empowerment platforms, often took on a more sinister role, clamping down on dissent and enabling arbitrary arrests. Many people were the victims of summary judgments by people's revolutionary tribunals, which sentenced lazy workers, counter-revolutionaries, and corrupt officials. Thomas Sankara himself would later admit on camera that the tribunals were often used by some people as occasions to settle private scores. On the economic front, President Sankara's decision to dissolve the feudal farming system aimed to sever the chains of exploitation. Yet this precipitated clashes with traditional leaders and steered social unrest. Additionally, Sankara's relations with labor unions began to sour. The president banned trade unions and political parties and put down protests, notably one by teachers in 1986. His dissolution of unions, replacing them with committees for the defense of the revolution, struck a sour note, fanning the flames of discontent among some of the people in Burkina Faso. Thomas Sankara's outspoken anti-imperialist stance and his vocal criticism of foreign aid strained his relationships with Western nations, most notably France, Burkina Faso's former colonial master. By 1987, Sankara was politically isolated. His enemies, who were a mix of the French political establishment and regional leaders like Ivorian President Félix Houphouët-Boigny, began to tire of him. He had humiliated French President François Mitterrand in public on a few occasions.
Je suis comme lui. Il dit ce qu'il pense, je le dis aussi. Et je trouve que dans un certain nombre de ses jugements, il a le tranchant d'une belle jeunesse et le mérite d'un chef d'État totalement dévoué à son peuple. Et moi, j'admire ses qualités qui sont grandes, mais il tranche trop aussi. Il va plus loin qu'il ne faut, à mon avis, qui me permettent de lui parler du haut de mon expérience.
At the same time, some of his citizens became wary of their leaders' policies. What Sankara continued to ignore was a growing skepticism about the efficacy of his policies and actions. In May of 1984, an alleged coup d'etat against Thomas Sankara erupted, and the alleged plotters were tried and executed in June of the same year. Perhaps most devastatingly, Thomas Sankara's radical reforms steered opposition within his own ranks, leading to his tragic downfall. His friend and confidant, Captain Blaise Compaoré, turned against him, orchestrating the coup that would ultimately cost Thomas Sankara's life. The relationship between Blaise Compaoré and Thomas Sankara, previously very close friends and brothers in arms, had turned bitter after the duo had a different view after the August Revolution of 1983. Some sources said that disagreements emerged over the implementation and pace of reforms following the revolution. Thomas Sankara, in his fervor for radical transformation, was determined to completely uproot the status quo. On the flip side, Blaise Compaoré, though also a revolutionary, was a bit more conservative in his approach. He reportedly squirmed at the breakneck speed of Sankara's reforms, uncomfortable with the magnitude of the changes. But ambition, they say, is a green-eyed monster. Some suggest that Blaise Compaoré, a powerful figure within Sankara's government and his second-in-command, may have been driven by the lure of power. On the morning of October 15, 1987, a day that will be etched in the annals of Burkina Faso's history, President Thomas Sankara held a meeting with Blaise Compaoré. Their agenda was to discuss the formation of a unified political party to preserve the revolution. Shortly after the meeting, the once peaceful presidential compound was shattered by the ominous sounds of gunfire. 12 people were killed that day, and among them was a beacon of the Burkinabe revolution, Thomas Sankara. Sankara's body was dismembered and he was quickly buried in an unmarked grave while his widow, Mariam, and 2 children fled out of the country. In the aftermath, the Revolutionary Council, now under Blaise Compaoré's rule, declared that Thomas Sankara had died of natural causes. The truth, however, could not be buried. Despite their attempts to distort the narrative, the reality of Sankara's brutal assassination sent shockwaves throughout Burkina Faso and the world. Though Blaise Compaoré pretended to publicly grieve for Sankara and promised to preserve his legacy, he quickly set about purging the government of Sankara's supporters. In contrast to the cool reception given to Sankara earlier, Compaoré was welcomed by Western governments and funding agencies. Within 3 years, Compaoré had accepted a massive IMF loan and instituted a structural adjustment program for Burkina Faso. The new leader also reversed most of Sankara's reforms. This included the insistence that his portrait be hung in all public places, as well as buying himself a presidential jet. One day I'll do a full video on Blaise Compaoré. Thomas Sankara is considered a beacon of hope, a voice for the voiceless, and a catalyst for revolutionary change. His vision and his legacy continue to inspire, reminding us of the cost of truth and the power of an unyielding spirit to challenge the status quo. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.